Hello, good afternoon or good morning, depending on where you are. And thank you for joining us today for our webinar entitled Creating a Frictionless Secure Environment for Collaboration and Teamwork. My name is Frank Urenia. I'm a principal architect with the Oxford Computer Group. And joining me today and doing most of the presentation will be Ryan Britton. Just to give you a bit of background on the OCG or Oxford Computer Group, if you're not familiar. If we could advance the slide, Ryan.
Yeah.
For those, again, not familiar with Oxford Computer Group, we have been in the business of providing and consulting around identity governance, and data protection for quite some time, 16 plus years to be exact. We've delivered over 100 enterprise projects around the world with over 7 million Office 365 seats being deployed, and we have been named Microsoft Identity Partner of the Year for 3 years running, from 2013 to 2015, and then most recently in 2018. And we do have very deep connections with Microsoft, the cloud engineering team, and the identity program team there, and also with our other partner, Savient, who's a provider of identity governance solutions. Like I mentioned at the outset, joining me is Ryan Britton. Ryan is with our partner, the Mint Group, and Ryan is an experienced technologist, evangelist, writer, software developer, an architect. He's skilled in translating business strategy into effective technology strategy. His strength includes software architecture design, technological project delivery, strategic planning, and helping organizations to differentiate and profit from the effective use of technology. On the screen, we do have a poll up, our first poll of the day. It's one of 5. I ask you to just give us some insight into how you're currently using, which identity platforms you're using. So if you could select from one of these choices, and then I'm going to hand it over to Ryan, and he will continue the rest of the presentation. Keep in mind too, if you do have questions, you can post them into the question area in the GoToWebinar section there, and we'll be trying to answer them throughout the rest of the webinar. Ryan, take it away.
Thank you very much, Frank. And thank you for the introduction. So let me start by introducing Mint Group as the organization that I work for. We were founded in 2001. We are a top 1% system integrator across the globe. And I'm not going to read out everything here, but essentially we are 130 plus employees. We were Dynamics 365 Inner Circle for 2 years, Data and Analytics and AI Finalist of the Year for last year, Cloud Platform Finalist of the Year. We are in FSI, public sector, government, education, healthcare, media, and retail. And we are situated across the globe in a number of regions, including South Africa, WECA, Nigeria, US, and APAC. And some highlights from FY18, where we were Managing Director Partner of the Year, Cloud CRM Dynamics Partner of the Year, and Modern Workplace Partner of the Year. We also hold a number of gold applications. I think there's 14 or 15 of them. They're on the bottom right-hand side of your screen. Most notably, obviously, would be Gold Cloud Platform and Productivity, which really speaks to the tenets of today's webinar. So our primary brands, as we said, are business applications through Dynamics 365, apps and infrastructure through Microsoft Azure, Modern Workplace through Microsoft 365, and obviously everything that we're discussing today falls in that purview. And then finally, data and analytics, including artificial intelligence and cognitive services. Okay, so into the meat and potatoes of our discussion today. Thank you everyone for joining us, and I hope that you'll find it interesting. What we're going to be discussing is something that is on everybody's lips these days, specifically any lips that have anything to do with Microsoft, and that is Microsoft Teams and Teams-based applications. It's a hot topic at the moment, and I think there are, besides Microsoft Teams, there are a number of other applications that are kind of enjoying some success from this. The reason that it is such a hot topic is that Microsoft Teams is the fastest growing application in Microsoft's history. And I think that the reason that these types of applications are becoming so prevalent is a number of reasons. First of all, they embrace chat-based communications. And I think that in our consulting, we found that most teams are using some kind of instant messenger application for informal chats and to keep their work moving forward when email is too cumbersome to do so. And even where we found that IT has clamped down on these types of IM messengers and people haven't deployed Teams, email then becomes a kind of chat-based communication where you have one-line emails going backwards and forwards. And I think that one of the things that is making these Teams-based apps so successful is the fact that it's making chat a first-class citizen and recognizing the fact that this is how the multiple generations in our workforce are getting things done. The other thing is integrated workspaces. So what we know is that most office workers have to move from application to application, a lot of them nowadays SaaS applications, in order to get their work done. And we're looking for, office workers are looking for workspaces that integrate all of those experiences together and minimize the cost of switching between these applications so that they can get work done more easily. And when I'm in a Teams-based application, if we're talking about simplified context switching, we're talking about being able to move from one team to the other and having all of the applications and chats and meeting information required for that specific team oriented around me. And when I switch teams, I want to change that context as well. The other thing that is a highlight of these apps is collaborative cloud-based document management, being able to collaborate on a document in real time together with transparent versioning, rather than relying on emailing backwards and forwards and creating multiple versions of documents and then having to manage all of that collateral. The other things that are making these things successful, I think, are seamless meeting experiences, where the meeting experience is integrated into the rest of the package, so that if you have a meeting, the transcripts are available in the same workspace, and so forth. And finally, I think that one of the big reasons that people are finding success with these applications is because it reduces email fatigue. Organizations where we have engaged with these types of Teams rollouts, we found that before they started in a Teams-based environment, everything was done through email, and the amount of email simply was too cumbersome for the average person to be able to process, and therefore it becomes very, very ineffective to use email in order to move work forward. I'm sure that you all know that if you're added onto an email thread 15 messages down, to go and find out what's been going on inside of that email thread, or even worse, if you're added to a project and you don't have access to all of those email threads, it might be almost impossible to go back into the project history and find out what's happened in order to bring yourself up to date. Okay, so that's really just to contextualize what we're talking about from a Microsoft Teams perspective. If we look at why teamwork and the interest in teamwork is so interesting to organizations, it's because we're finding more and more that teamwork is how things are getting done. There are twice as many teams compared to 5 years ago. There's a 50% increase in collaborative work, and there are you're 5 times more likely to be high performing inside of a team. And obviously with these benefits come inhibitors as well. Teams contain internal and external members. They are geographically distributed, and we have a very diverse workforce which has different expectations and preferences from the tools that they're using. Okay. I'm going to pop a quick poll onto the screen just to ask whether or not your organizations are using Teams. Give us a little bit of insight into how many of you guys are already set up with this. I'm just going to give it a few minutes to put your answers in. There we go. Great. Thanks, everyone. Okay, moving swiftly along. The problem with pursuing Teams is that it puts a lot of pressure on identity and access. And at the same time, the landscape of identity and access has very specific problems that it's trying to deal with. It has a bring your own device problem, where a lot of the devices that the organization is using in order to house its content is not even owned by the organization. There are a lot of SaaS application ecosystems which have to integrate with the existing identity landscape. There's a remote and distributed workforce, as we said, so it's not as easy as just keeping your IT within four walls anymore. Cloud environments are complicating things, and cyber attacks are becoming more and more advanced, including things like social engineering. And this means that as people are starting to move to the cloud, and as they're starting to look at expanding their borders to create these teams that go further than the organizational boundaries, there are very real dangers in terms of security that they may be exposed to in the process of doing this. And then there is the data and information element, which talks about the fact that the security as we know it in terms of identity, in terms of access controls, in terms of threat analytics and so forth is essential to every organization. But it's also important to start to identify and quantify what your information is and how it gets distributed. And what we're finding is that as we go from organization to organization, in the interests of developing these types of ecosystems, we find that there may be content sprawl, where organizations have kind of given users the power to decide where things are stored and how they are stored. And this has grown organically over time. And there is untracked growth of content. Information leaks outside of the organization. There is a low level of compliance simply because once you have this information ecosystem or landscape that has grown organically and is unstructured, to be able to identify how you would become compliant within that landscape is quite difficult. And obviously that then leads to ineffective governance as well. So what we're trying to say is that there is an intersection of security, content, teamwork, and compliance. And what we're finding is that organizations are saying, well, teamwork is what's most important to us, so we're going to focus on that. And the problem is that if you focus on teamwork, you might be compromising security in order to do that. And if you focus solely on security, you may be locking down your ability to create these teams and effectively hamstringing the ability to collaborate. By the same token, you may find that if you are content focused, you increase your compliance risk. You enable your organization to be able to very quickly create content and decide where to store it and to manage the life cycle of that content on their own. That then takes the power away from your compliance managers and their ability to ensure that you are compliant in terms of information protection policies, for instance. And so what is really needed is to be able to put all of these things, identity and security, content, compliance, and teamwork on the table, and to walk a knife's edge where you have the non-negotiables of identity and security and the desirables of teamwork and the necessities of compliance, and also the value of information management and content development, all represented, and that the compromises that you're making for one of the other are really explicit. And one of the things that we've found is that there's actually a whole bunch of tools that are being developed now specifically just to try and govern Microsoft Teams and these Teams applications because of the team sprawl that's being created, where organizations are empowering users to create these teams without considering the other elements that feed into that decision. And that brings us to what we believe are the pillars of productivity. And in order to achieve, and for an organization to achieve continuous productivity, security, compliance, and governance, we believe that there are three pillars that they need to address. The one is security, access, identity, and trust. And for those of you who have worked with the Oxford, know that this is really where they excel. They have a very close relationship with the Microsoft product teams, and they're one of the best organizations for developing these types of solutions. And I would say that that is the non-negotiable foundation for these types of endeavors inside of an organization. The other pillars then are information architecture and records management, understanding where your information is created, how it is distributed, and essentially, previously, the worlds of content management and records management were divorced. There were different types of systems that managed these very different environments. What we're finding is that we're reaching a point now where organizations want to try and meld these worlds together so that there is one life cycle that speaks to how content is created, when it can be shared, how it can be shared, at what point it becomes a record, and the compliance that is necessary thereafter to determine how long those records are kept and which events trigger that record keeping process. I'm not going to delve into all of the individual pillars that go along with this, but what I will do is I'm just going to pop up a quick poll just to get some info from you guys. And I seem to have lost the polls. Apologies. Frank or Jax, could you pop up the next poll for us?
Yeah, that's, I think Jackie got it there.
Yeah. Okay. Just let me know when you've closed it and I'll advance onto the next slide. Okay, so here's another way of looking at it. The image on the right-hand side comes from Microsoft's documentation on their content services. And what you can see in this layered diagram is essentially on the far left-hand side, you have your content storage, and then you have a layer that represents what they're calling perpetual, which includes availability, performance, encryption, indexing, and a whole bunch of intelligence. And essentially, this is the stuff that comes with an Office 365 platform and what we expect to get from a SaaS application of this type. The next layer is that policy-driven layer. And here, the obvious element that you can see there is the access control element, which encompasses identity as well and speaks to creating this identity ecosystem and speaking to the security requirements before pursuing any of the other tenets. The other one that's interesting there is the establishment of policies for retention and classification. And what this essentially means is that there is a due diligence that needs to happen in terms of an organization's information in order to understand where it is situated and how it develops. And not only that, to classify the differences between one piece of information and another piece of information so that we can determine what is sensitive and what is not sensitive. And I think that what we're finding is that a lot of organizations are kind of skipping this step and moving straight towards creating teams and trying to collaborate. And we would suggest from our experience that skipping over this step makes it very, very difficult to put a team environment together that is very collaborative at the same time as it is secure and diligent. The next layer is obviously your user-centric layer, and here is where the magic happens that enables office workers to really become productive. We're talking about being able to share internally and externally to create transparent collaboration where multiple people can work on documents at the same time, and essentially making information discoverable so that people aren't repeatedly creating the same knowledge. And obviously, those layers are then exposed through the apps we know and love inside of the Office 365 suite, as well as apps inside of partner ecosystems, and those are surfaced onto the different devices, obviously. Okay. All right, so what can we do in order to identify risk within our own organizations? And there's a few things that I think would speak to a potential for immediately pursuing teamwork platforms when the right foundations aren't in place within your organization. Obviously, one of them would be if you have a fractured identity landscape, if you're not enabled for single sign-on, if you don't use multi-factor authentication, and you're not using a single identity to identify a person throughout your ecosystem. Device management is obviously another one. You don't have complete control over your devices, including devices that don't necessarily belong to the organization. This might be an indication that you should be concerned about what teamwork might expose. Security threat analysis. So if you are on the cloud journey, there is a, they say that the cost of peace is eternal vigilance. And in the cloud environment, I would say that's certainly true. That would mean that anomaly detection, analytics, attack simulation, all of those things become a reality. And essentially, an organization should be modeling those types of things and really looking at their ecosystem to try and identify these threats before they happen as much as possible. And that would certainly be something that you would want to have invested into and be comfortable with before you pursued a team's implementation. And we've dealt with a number of organizations where we've started a team's rollout or the adoption process or started rolling out an information management landscape only to be blocked by the fact that the identity landscape had not been properly matured up to a point. The other thing then is personal laptops, and I know that from a device management perspective that speaks to the same thing. But what we're talking about here is that a lot of organizations in their movement to cloud have a problem where people's personal laptops contain a lot of information that has been saved to the local disk. And it's very, very difficult for organizations to identify what that information is, whether it's sensitive, and to control its life cycle. And then there is the famous shadow IT element, and we've actually worked with a number of organizations where they have very, very tight control over what sharing mechanisms they put in place in order to govern when sharing can happen outside of the organization in terms of the organization's assets. And what the employee does is install another application, a Google Drive or something similar, and simply bypasses all of those controls and essentially through shadow IT compromises the information that the organization is trying to protect. The other element is sensitive information. And what we mean here is that if I put two files side by side, it's sometimes difficult to identify which file contains sensitive information and which doesn't. And in a lot of instances, it's easier for a human being to do so. And I actually have an example of that in the demo, than it is for a computer to determine this is something that can be easily distributed and this is something that should not be distributed outside of the organization. Shared drives. Organizations generally that we work with have some form of on-premise file server if they haven't done their cloud migration already or are in the process of doing this. And these file servers have organic file structures. They've grown organically over time, and they're distributed. There might be, several of these types of shared drives that people store their information into, and the actual folder structure within those repositories is unorganized as well, or it's, people have, depending on who is storing the information, they will determine the structure. And that has two issues. First of all, it makes it difficult to govern. It also makes it difficult to discover content. And then that leads to content and team sprawl, where people are continuously recreating knowledge because they cannot discover content or content is being created in little pockets. And what you'll find with people who implement these types of teams ecosystems is that suddenly you have 80 teams, and each one of those teams are saving documents into isolated file structures that they are determining the structure of. And it's very difficult in that situation for someone who is tasked with compliance and for identifying, certain record types that need to be managed for a period of time, or certain personally identifiable information that needs to be managed within a very specific life cycle in terms of FOIA or in terms of GDPR, and bringing that all together and managing that information across this very dispersed landscape. And in a lot of instances, people are not even aware of their compliance obligations, and it's sad to say that we've dealt with some people or some organizations where the only time that they've really looked at the compliance question is when they have had an e-discovery request or litigation, and that might lead to a fine, which is a difficult way to decide to invest into that. And then finally, role and team profiles. So if you're going to unlock these team workspaces for your organization, you should understand what types of teams are going to use that platform, when the teams are created, when they need to be sunsetted, what types of roles exist within those teams, and how they will work with content, and what type of content they will work with. And doing this beforehand will really give you a much better governance picture that enables you to manage the life cycle of when these teams are created and when they are destroyed, and what happens to the information once the team is destroyed. Okay. I think we have another poll that we can pop up at this stage. Okay. Okay, thanks everyone. Okay, and so finally I'm going to talk about some considerations, and this is really from our personal experience in implementing these types of things, and hopefully it's something that will bring some value and provoke some thought from you guys if you're considering this or you have done it. First of all, email sensitivity tricks. One of the difficult things to get right is email communication within the organization from a sensitivity perspective. Some of the things that I've seen that have worked is if you set your email sensitivity, and we're going to, in the demo, we'll talk about what we mean by email sensitivity, but for the sake of this discussion, email that could be distributed outside of the organization, email that should only be internally focused, and really identifying whether or not information should be forwarded on, for instance. And a good way of doing that, for instance, is to default the sensitivity of all email to internal email, which means that if someone tries to send an email that is defaulted to that sensitivity outside of the organization, they won't be able to. And that will motivate them to identify whether an email is then external business information, which can be forwarded on, external sensitive business information, which can only go to an intended recipient and can't be forwarded further than that, or otherwise personal email. And doing something like this really gives you the ability to then take something as amorphous as email and start to put some governances around it that will allow you to determine the sensitivity of emails and put some policies in place to govern how that information is dispersed outside of the organization. The other thing is the SharePoint landscape. So a lot of organizations have intranets, and if they were built on SharePoint a number of years ago, they have a very deep hierarchical structure. And what we've learned from information management over the last few years has brought us to a point where the SharePoint structuring has been modernized. And as such, when creating these SharePoint structures, you want to use what we call a hub system, where it's easy to move information from one hub to another hub, and where the entire structure is flat. And without delving too deeply into it, what it means is that you don't end up with 19 levels of subsites and information stored in so deep within that hierarchy that it becomes very, very easy to discover. Instead, what you want is a very, very flat structure oriented around hubs that might be specific to a location, specific to employees, oriented around technology, or whatever else the case may be. And really give people the ability to very quickly find information and to navigate through those structures. Using OneDrive effectively is another one. So OneDrive is a great improvement from people storing things on their local laptop, because it gives you a redundancy in terms of that information, and it also gives you an element of governance over what people are storing on their local hard drives. The problem is that OneDrive storage is largely unstructured, and people will determine their own file structures within that. And from a compliance and governance perspective, that can be quite difficult. It's also a personal storage space, so it can end up with personal information inside of it, sensitive information inside of it. A very good practice is to put a policy in place that expires OneDrive content after a period of time, say 90 days. And what that essentially does is it turns it into a temporary drive, which means that it would be great if you need to have a document for offline editing because you're going on a plane, or because it's convenient at the time, but you are always aware in the back of your mind that any documentation that you create or information that you create inside of your OneDrive has a limited lifespan, and that you really want to move it into a more structured SharePoint ecosystem as quickly as possible. Some of the other things: control versioning and distribution. If you have a cloud based system, you are able to control versioning and distribution quite well. The versioning actually becomes transparent, except in instances where you don't want multiple people editing the same document at the same time, and then you can go back to the kind of checkout, check-in processes that I'm sure we're all aware of. Document workflows, and this is important in these team type environments, because what you'll find is that if you're creating a team for a specific reason, say because of a project, you want to have all of your project collateral sitting inside of this team, and it's going to have a life cycle. At the death of that project, you want to sunset that team, and you need to know what is going to happen to the information that is currently sitting inside of that. Some of it may be required to be retained from a records management perspective, and other things you may just want to keep for posterity because it could be a reference. If you have a similar RFP, you might want to go and find that previous RFP document and just reuse the content. And creating these types of workflows that will automate the process of identifying which content goes where, and perhaps moving it from a satellite project site into a central repository of RFPs. These are the types of things that you would want to be thinking about when you determine the types of teams and the types of roles that work within these teams. And then finally, team life cycles is really an extension of that. All teams should really have a life cycle. Some of them will have long life cycles. You may have a team that represents an entire department, for instance, but you really want to be thinking about the fact that teams are temporary things, and that you need to have a cross-cutting concern like governance and compliance that is planned for these life cycles, so that you have the due diligence built into the ecosystem. And then finally, managing Office 365 groups. So Office 365 groups are great because they have a very, very simplified permission structure, and generally you can hand over the management of that Office 365 group to a set of owners. And when we say that, a lot of IT teams get very nervous, because IT teams generally like to maintain and manage permissions very, very closely, and not to delegate that to non-IT personnel. What we found in a lot of instances, though, is that if they can create the creation, or rather manage the creation of those Office 365 groups, delegating the ownership is okay, because in a situation where IT is responsible for a user group, for instance, if someone needs to be added to that group, the owners are actually the only people who can make that call. So just to give a practical example, so that it's not a ramble, if I was part of a project team and I just joined and I didn't have permission to access the project site, and I went to IT and said, please can you give me permission to access the project site, IT would actually have to go back to the project owner and say, can this guy have access to the project site? And so Office 365 groups are very, very important also, because they're actually the underpinning structure for not only Microsoft Teams, but also for SharePoint team sites. And if you structure your Office 365 groups in the correct way, you'll have an Office 365 group as a foundation with the right owners. And on top of that, you will have your SharePoint team site, which will contain all of your documents. And on top of that, you will finally layer your Microsoft Teams instance, which will then dip into that documentation and provide a window into those files and bring in all of your SaaS applications at the same time. And the nice thing about creating these Office 365 groups in a self-managed format is that the permission structure is not hierarchical. So what it means is that you won't accidentally give permissions to a team that or a set of files that wasn't intended simply because you don't understand the permission hierarchy or what the relationships are. You're kind of looking at a satellite permission group that really has no permissions whatsoever in any other team site or Microsoft Teams instance. And once you have that, then that really gives you the ability to do controlled sharing, where you kind of have a limited risk area being one team with its Office 365 group and its individual members, and therefore having external parties get access to that specific group becomes a lot easier to manage from a permissions perspective. All right, let's swap over and do some quick demos. I'm just going to walk through some stuff that has to do with what we're discussing. I'm not going into any depth of detail. This is really just to give everyone an idea of what the landscape looks like inside of Office 365 when you're looking at these pillars that we're talking about. Essentially, if you're inside of your Office 365 admin page and and you go to show all, you will see towards the bottom that there is a security and a compliance center. The interesting thing about this, and I'm going to just pop to another tab, is that there is actually a security and compliance center that is combined. And what is happening in the Office 365 ecosystem at the moment is that Microsoft started with security and compliance in a single admin center, and they're busy splitting them out. So what you'll find is that there's some functionality that doesn't exist in the one that does exist in the other. But essentially, just to make the case of the interconnectedness of all of these pillars, compliance and security have lived quite well together in a central space simply because they are so reliant on one another. And I'm just going to show you some things inside of this compliance center, starting with classification. So when we talk about classification, what we're talking about is the ability to label information. And when we're talking about the labeling information, we're talking about emails, we're talking about documents, in some instances, we're even talking about chats. Office 365 currently has two types of labels. The one's called sensitivity labels, which essentially governs the distribution of information. It identifies whether a piece of information is, and you can see some examples here, if it's confidential for finance, if it's internal, if it's personal, if it's highly confidential. And the idea behind these policies is that you can use them to enforce whether or not a person can forward an email on, for instance. Then we have retention labels. So again, we're talking about being able to tag these labels onto a piece of information, like a document. Here we're creating policies that speak to how long a piece of information needs to be retained for. And this is really records keeping in place. The idea behind it is that once you've labeled a file, you're able to enforce a policy for retention of that file for a number of years. So for instance, employee records here you can see are maintained forever, and personal financial PII is maintained for 3 years. We spoke about being able to enforce policies from a sensitivity perspective. This is essentially for data loss prevention. Putting the right types of policies in place can stop sensitive information from being attached to emails and passed outside of the organization or being used inside of shadow IT applications. Okay. And then records management is really an extension of those retention labels that we were talking about. If I go into the file plan here, you'll see that, let's go down a bit here. You'll see that here all of my labels are identified and listed, and this is essentially where I would manage my file retention schedule. When we're talking about events, what we're speaking about is that one of the things that you'll find from a records retention perspective is that there is a set of records that are retained based on when they were modified last or when they were initially created, but there are another set of records that are triggered by a specific event within the system. The nice thing about these events is that you can have an event like a project finishing, and when you fire this event, all of the information that has been tagged with that project's identifier, so it's in a specific folder for that project, it's an email that has been tagged into a public folder for that specific project, all of that content immediately gets tagged with the same label, and its records retention process will begin. Okay. All right. Okay, and then there's some other stuff here which I'm not going to go into. I mean, threat management and everything is a little bit outside of the scope here. But essentially what this shows is that all of this stuff is really coexisting in the same place. And what we're looking at is managing our policies for information management along with our policies for security. And I think that's most prevalent. If you go onto the home page here, you'll see that we have our Microsoft Secure Score. It's on the right-hand side of the screen on there, and you can see what the secure score has been over a period of time. And for those of you who know, the secure score is essentially an evaluation of compliance to certain security regulations. If I now pop over to the compliance center, okay, so this is the new compliance center that's been separated out from the security and compliance center, you'll see that what we have here now is we have a Microsoft compliance score. And this is actually building on top of the security score. And you'll see that here we have ISO 27001, and we have NIST, and we have GDPR, and there are a number of other compliances that you can track inside of the Office 365 portal in this manner. I'm actually going to show you what the compliance management portal looks like. I have to sign in quickly. So this is just drilling down into that compliance score now. And essentially what you can do here is you can actually go and manage your remediation against these compliances once it's been correctly set up. Just give it a moment to load. Okay, so I can kill that. I can actually go into one of these. If I'm interested in GDPR, for instance, okay, and you can see that here I can actually go and see what the controls are, what my current rating is, assign tasks to users, and this is really great for remediating compliance from this perspective. Okay. All right, then I have one more thing to show you, and that's just what this looks like inside of an actual SharePoint site. We're talking about labels, and it might be a bit difficult to orient what that looks like. So what I've done is I've created an intranet site here, and I've got Ryan's team, which is a team site that I've set up. So this is an Office 365 group that has a team site built on top of it. And over here, I've created a folder and I've called it All Our Documents. And what you can see here, and this might be something that you've seen before, I have super secret company IP here, and I also have the lunch menu. And for a system, it's very difficult to tell which I should be allowed to distribute to any employee in the organization and outside of the organization if someone else is coming for lunch, and what I shouldn't. In some instances, and the Office 365 is able to identify social security numbers and financial information, etc., and to try and mitigate this to some level. But but it's probably not going to find my company's IP. And nothing stops me from then distributing this outside of the organization if we're not using sensitivity labels to manage this. So I just want to show you what a sensitivity label looks like. I'm going to be manually creating these. There's my retention label. Okay, so I can't see the sensitivity labels here for some reason, so I'm just going to show you the retention label. It's basically exactly the same for any one of them. So essentially, you want to tag your documents with a sensitivity label and with a retention label. If this super secret company IP is no longer going to be changed, or it's been superseded by another document, I can come and choose one of these policies. Now, I'm choosing it. You obviously don't want people to come and choose the policy and manually manage this. And that is why the right due diligence is so important and why the right structuring is so important. What you want to have done is have created a site specifically for super secret company IP, so that when you save a document into that folder, it automatically has the right retention rules applied to it, etc. Okay, so now that this has been labeled as a record, if I go and try to delete it, okay, I'm unable to do so because it's now been labeled as a record. Okay. All right, so that's everything that I wanted to show from a demo perspective. I suppose what I really wanted to drive as the point of this demo is that we've spoken about the fact that you can label information, you can manage its distribution, that there are certain controls in place that allow you to manage even shadow IT and a whole number of things, but that there is a due diligence that needs to happen in terms of the way that an organization understands and structures its information, as well as its identity and security, before it can get to the point where it can really make an effective team ecosystem. Okay. All right. Pop back here. Okay, so we're gonna open the floor for we've got 12 minutes left, so a few minutes of Q&A. Before we do so, if you're going to drop off and not sit through the entire QA, we do have a set of next actions for you, and that would be that if you like what you've seen here and you think that it's interesting and you'd like to know more, please feel free to contact Frank and myself, and we'd be more than happy to come and chat to you guys about our experiences and our thoughts on the matter.
Well, Brian, you want me to put up that last poll?
Yeah, I think that's a good idea.
Okay. Okay.
Okay, thank you everyone for your attention. I know that there was a lot of information in a very short span of time. I hope that it was informative, and we'd be happy to field any questions that you guys might have.
I think everyone you're on mute, so you can either use the raise hand or type your question in the question box there.
Yeah.
And if you raise hand, I can unmute you. You can use your voice. All right, we have a question from Eric. Ryan, what level of O365 licenses are required to utilize the functionality you demoed?
Okay, so everything that I demoed was on an E3 license. There are some advanced governance functionalities that require an E5 license. and you can mix and match to a certain degree. So you don't have to have everyone on an E5 license in order to do it. Your records managers might need to be, and it really depends on the level of interaction that you have with your records. But everything that you saw in the demo was E3.
Anyone else? All right. We have unmute you, Ken. Ken, go ahead.
Hi, Ryan. Frank, thanks for the session. I just wanted to ask, how would you manage physical records that may be required maybe as part of construction projects, as part of a team's records management approach?
Yeah. So as it currently stands, Office 365 is not really geared for physical records management. You need there are a number of very good third-party tools that will allow you to do that type of physical records management. We've actually done it for a number of organizations. If you have a specific requirement, Ken, I'd be happy to chat to you about it. But essentially, the short answer is what you want to look to do is there are established products that can manage the physical records capture process as well as its storage and its retrieval and so forth. And they are integrated into Office 365 so that you can still pull those records as part of an e-discovery search, for instance.
Thanks so much.
Does that answer the question?
Okay, thank you, Ken.
Okay. All right. Frank, should we wrap it up? I don't see any more questions.
Yeah, it looks like the questions have died down. So if we can wrap up here, we'd like to thank. Oh, we do have one more just came in. Can the cloud solution be extended to on-prem? That's from.
That's a bit of a broad question. Can the cloud solution be extended to on-prem? Are you talking about being able to pull records into Office 365 and apply labels to them? Because the answer to that is the labels survive with the document. So you could have, once you've tagged a document with labels, they will stick with the document. So you can take the document out of Office 365 and you can bring it back in. The problem is that if you take it outside of Office 365 and store it somewhere else, you're not going to have a process that is going to enforce the records retention schedule and lifecycle events on that document. So the intent is that you should keep it in the Office 365 ecosystem rather. And actually, one of the design practices that we try to follow is to try and keep documents at their intended end destination as much as possible. You can use workflows to move them around and so forth. But if you have a situation where people are moving documents around all of the time, it makes it difficult to manage from a compliance perspective and from a security perspective. It's much better if you decide that you want to create a record where it should reside for its entire life cycle, and then orient access to that record from external sources, those types of things, without moving the record.
Yep, that gets a thank you, Ryan, so that answered the question.
Great. Okay, guys. Well, from my side, thank you very much. I hope you found this all informative. Frank, do you want to wrap us up?
Yep, sure. So, yep, thanks everyone for joining us today. There will be a recording available. I think that will be emailed out to those who attended or those who have registered. We'll get a link to view the recording. Once again, thanks for taking out the time today, and we look forward to seeing you at our next webinar. Have a good day, everybody.